Welcome to the Mona Charen Show. So glad you could join us. I am thrilled today to welcome Sam Tanenhaus, the author of this fantastic new biography of William F. Buckley. Here's the cover, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. So I should clarify for those who don't necessarily know that Bill Buckley was a very important figure in my life. He was my mentor. He was my friend. And we occasionally had some tangles, a few little things, as friends do. But I have been eagerly anticipating this book for a very long time. Well, Sam, first of all, congratulations on the book. And second, why did you keep us all waiting so long?
First, I want to offer a gift to your viewers, Mona. To those of you who have not seen the 60 Minutes profile of Bill Buckley made right after Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, you will see footage of an editorial meeting, and you will see the even younger Mona Charen
Is that
seated around the table.
How did I not remember that? That's so funny.
It was a little while ago, which gets to how long it took to write this book. Well, there are different ways to tell that story, so I'm going to tell you one, because I think you and viewers will get it. When I signed the contract for this book, it was in 1998. Bill Buckley, as everyone called him, yourself included, was always Bill, had 10 years more to live, and the world looked quite different. Here's the book I thought I was going to be writing. It would be the story of the man whose triumphant crusade to battle the forces of anti-democratic communism had won. He'd actually won this extraordinary global battle. The sitting president in his second term, Bill Clinton, a centrist Democrat, was universally understood to be standing in the shadow of Ronald Reagan, the president Buckley had done so much to elect. And the world of Bill Buckley and conservatism, your world from the inside and mine as a close admiring observer, looked a lot different than it became not all that much afterward. So what I had to do was rethink the story I'm telling. The facts don't change. Bill Buckley's a giant. We get that. We know that. But the surrounding story became somewhat different. And I'll add one more thing to that, Mona, then you and I will just go back and forth. And that is, I had a day job for part of that time. I was the editor of the New York Times Book Review for close to 10 years. And I am not, unlike Bill Buckley, and maybe yourself, I am not a master multitasker. I kind of do one thing at a time. So I didn't really get started on this book. I'd done some work on it. I talked to him for endless hours. I had free access to all the archives, to his friends, family, all of that. But the writing part, is the key. And that really didn't begin until I left the Times, took a buyout in December of 2014. So really the book took 8 or 9 years to write, which is not uncommon for a great big biography.
No, it sure isn't. And this is a magisterial book, and you're a great writer. So congratulations on that. So let's go back to why you wanted to write this book. So you would consider yourself what, center left? Where would you place yourself on the spectrum? Okay.
I'm not comfortable with any of the terms, but I know other people are. So let's say center left.
Okay.
Is the one that we would use today. In my day, it would have been like anti-communist liberal. These terms that don't exist anymore.
Yeah. But they were incredibly important in their time. But so why Buckley then? I mean, I would think if you were going to be devoting this kind of scholarly work on somebody, it would more likely be someone with whom you felt simpatico just on all levels. But you were drawn to him, and I'm curious about why.
I did feel simpatico with him. Mona, you knew him. Of all the great people, look, we're journalists, and just to be an ordinary workaday journalist is to be in the company of a lot of hugely important people. It's one reason we like to do it. I don't know what your experience was like. Mine was, this was the first one who did not treat me like a piece of furniture. It didn't matter what. A friend of mine, actually a neighbor, worked for Bob Dole in the 96 campaign. And she said, oh, he never asked me a question about myself. And she liked Bob Dole. Bill Buckley did ask you about you. Look, where are you
all
from?
the time.
What are you reading? What do you think, Mona? Do you think that's a good novel? And it's not like, how rich is your family? You know, he never cared about that. It's always, oh, really? You like that piece in the New Yorker last week? And he once told me, said, I only talk about politics when somebody pays me to do it. Well, they paid him a lot to do it, and he liked money. So there was a lot of political talk. So he fascinated me, but I'll give you some more specific examples of that too. So as you probably know, and maybe even some viewers today do, I worked on a big biography before this one of Whittaker Chambers, who was one of Buckley's idols. At the same time, Buckley was his close friend. And in that weird way he had, Buckley was his sponsor, though he was almost a quarter century younger. And when I was working on the Chambers book in 1990, when I was really a nobody from nowhere, I'm not much less of a nobody from nowhere now.
You're not a nobody from nowhere.
I was even more of one then. And I knew Buckley was the guy I had to get to, that he understood the world of Chambers and all this. And so I contacted him, and he expressed tentative interest. Then he invited my wife and me to his house, his beautiful house in Stamford, Connecticut. Now, he saw that I was a pretty good writer. That was, as you know, that was really paramount to him. The National Review's publisher, Bill Rusher, said, it's a good thing the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we would have lost Buckley, right?
Such a great quote, and it's so true. He loved talent, and he was a talent spotter.
That's it. How did he find you?
So that's sort of a long story that I won't bore our listeners with, but I was the editor of the Columbia undergraduate yearbook when I was in college. I was a big fan of his, but I pretended not to be. I pretended to be a basic, garden variety liberal college student, asked him for an interview, made him laugh in the letter where I asked. And so then we got together, we met. I didn't reveal throughout all of our exchanges for the yearbook interview that I was actually a big fan of his.
You were being a good journalist. Student journalist.
And so after it came out, I sent him a copy and thanked him. And in the introduction to the interview, I then unburdened myself to the readers and said, I'm a huge fan. You guys may have certain impressions about him, but give it a chance. And so then he wrote back to me and said, you were remarkably discreet during our exchanges. I had no idea you were a conservative. And why don't you come down and meet Priscilla, who was the managing editor at National Review. By that time, I was a senior. His older sister. I was then a senior in college. And they offered me Paul Gigot, my predecessor in the lowly job of editorial assistant at National Review, was moving on to the Wall Street Journal. And so there was an opening.
Paul Gigot went to the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, he was first going to Asia, actually, but as a correspondent. But anyway, so yeah, that's a shortened version of my story there, and but so he didn't so much find me as I made myself get found, if you see what I mean.
Well, you're not the only one who did that. David Brooks did the same thing.
He did. Yeah, David was really overt. He
was. And nobody knew. So we're talking about how this book got to be written. Nobody knew. And David, did not remember just how overt he'd been, because the story everyone told was how when David was an undergrad at the University of Chicago, he was already a brilliant writer. And remember, in those days, he was a humorist. He was a humorist for many years before he became kind of a sage. And he wrote a parody of Buckley's book, Overdrive, published it, and that's what everyone remembers. And he ends it by saying, will you hire me? And Buckley, in front of an audience, says, at University of Chicago, where's David Brooks? I'd like to give him a job. What had been forgotten till I got a hold of the original article, which ran in a University of Chicago student publication, it was how explicitly David had said, I need a job. So brother Bill, can you spare me a dime? He'd forgotten that. So I sent it to David and he said, I'm an even bigger suck up than I thought. So I'm telling you that. I haven't told anybody else that.
You know what? For young people who are listening, I mean, people our age tend to sort of recreate the mythology about their origins and, clean it up. But if you look back into people's actual first efforts at finding jobs, I bet you will frequently find people, either flattering or throwing themselves in the path of somebody that they admire or doing a whole series of things to put themselves out there. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that most of us try to cover it up later.
Yeah, we kind of scrub that part of our history. Well, and so now we get to this, writing of a biography and why Buckley. So I'm going to tell you a couple of other things about that. So finally he decides that maybe he can trust me. And the concern, by the way, was not ideological. It was that, this is when I was writing about Chambers, it was that another guy was supposed to write that book and he had just disappeared. And Buckley and others had invested a lot of hope and energy in him. And so they'd gotten a little gun shy because Chambers is kind of a hard guy to write about. Whittaker Chambers, the famous witness in the Alger Hiss case. Well, so then Buckley thought I really meant business. So he invited me and my wife to dinner with him and his socialite wife, Pat. Okay, Mona, we're in our early 30s. We are not wealthy people. We are not socially connected. We're living in this like top of the house garret apartment in Tarrytown. And William F. Buckley and Pat, who if anything was larger in life than he was, invite us over for dinner. And we don't know what to do. I mean, because we have no money. I had my wedding suit, so I could wear that. Kathy had, she has nice clothes. So many women do. She had a dress ready to go. And so we're dressed as well as we can be. And the phone rings. And I wish I could do voices. There are people who do great Buckley impersonations, including the late Philip Roth did one for me once, the great novelist. And so I'm not going to do the impersonation, but I remember the language. And he said, Pat wanted you to know you should wear beach clothes. And I look at Kathy and say, nice. What are beach clothes? We don't know what they are, but we know what they're not. We're not supposed to dress up. And Pat knows that's what we're going to do. It wouldn't cross Bill Buckley's mind. She knows that's what we're going to do. So then we go to the house. Again, this is 1990. It's about a 40-minute drive from where we lived then. We live in Connecticut now. Then we lived in Westchester County near the Hudson River. So you drive across the state border and you go to Stamford, Connecticut. I said, well, how did we get there, Bill? And again, I can't do the voice. He said, well, you access Interstate I-95 and go north and pursue it until it debouches at exit 9. And I said to my wife, he sounds just like he does on television. That's actually how he talks. It's a kind of X-rated Noel Coward is one way to describe Buckley. And that is how people describe him. So then we go to the music room. Where he has the famous clavichord, where some of the world's greatest musicians not only performed for Buckley, but recorded classic albums. I mean, that are masterpieces that are coveted by classic music aficionados. So this is the atmosphere you're in. Pat Buckley comes in. Remember, the Buckleys always had one kind of dog. It was a King Charles Cavalier Spaniel. Yeah. She comes in with one in each arm. And my wife, Kathy, was about 8 months pregnant, or, she comes in with these two puppies, thrusts them at Kathy. Kathy's great with animals. And the dogs love her. So she thrusts them at Kathy as we get ready to go out to dinner. Kathy moves from the table and a wine glass breaks on the floor. And instantly Pat Buckley says, it's from Pottery Barn. It cost $1. First of all, Mona, I don't think it was from Pottery Barn. Second, if it was, it didn't cost $1. But she knew to say that. And that's the thing that made you feel you were entering a totally different world. Now, whether it's a better world or worse world, we'll let other people decide. To me, as a writer, it's Oz. It's magical. And that's what happened to person after person, all the great proteges, the Joan Didions and Gary Willses and George Wills and John Leonards and Mona Charens and Rick Brookhiser. You're all pulled into this universe that feels magical. So as I was working on Chambers, I thought, this is the next guy. And I'll give you one more reason. Somebody I really wanted to interview for the Chambers book, because I just read his wonderful little memoir, Confessions of a Conservative, was a great historian and religious thinker and writer, Gary Wills, who had been Buckley's proudest protege and also most lamented apostate, it called him, because Gary went pretty far to the left, something that would never happen in our own era. No one would ever be on the right and then move a little bit to the left, right? So I wrote him a letter, and in those days, you type the letter, put it in the envelope, put it in the mail, and hope for the best. Weeks go by, I don't hear from Gary Wills, and I'd heard Wills could be a little difficult, and so I mentioned it to Bill Buckley. And the phone rings. Remember how the phone would ring and you'd hear his voice instantly. And then when it was over, he'd slam down the receiver. He would never say goodbye on the phone. So I pick up the phone and he says, I haven't spoken with Gary Wills in 20 years, but he's waiting for your phone call now. And I thought, like, who does that exactly?
Yeah.
It's a guy who creates a huge movement. He wants to solve all the little problems. He wants to solve your problem. He actually kind of wants to talk to Gary Wills, and I've given him an excuse to do it. And it's fun for him. So I thought, this guy is worth knowing better and writing about.
So if I can summarize the stories you just told and the things you just said, I would say that what attracted you and me and many others is the man's largeness of spirit. And it is in such contrast to what is admired today on the right, which I won't, I don't have to spell that out. But that's one of the reasons. I mean, his unfailing politeness to people. You tell the story in the book about there were people on the right who did not respect Muhammad Ali's decision to change his name from Cassius Clay and would still persist in calling him Cassius Clay. And Bill Buckley had him on his show Firing Line, and he said in the introduction, he has changed his name, and that, therefore we will call him Muhammad Ali. I mean, he treated other human beings with respect. And that is something that, I won't say it has died with him, but it's worth remembering that that was considered admirable.
Well, not only, Mona, I'm glad you're the first person. I've talked to a number of people about this book. You're the first one to bring up that fantastic interview with Muhammad Ali, which your viewers can see on YouTube. You can see these two beautiful men, Ali and Buckley, at the prime of their lives. And the mutual respect is just like through the roof between the two of them. And but the interesting thing is it wasn't just conservatives who refused to call Ali Ali. It was the New York Times' own sports writers who were still calling him Cassius Clay. And Bill Buckley said, you're absolutely right. He said he's calling himself Muhammad Ali. And if he decides tomorrow he's Cassius Clay, again, that's what we'll call him. And it was that deep personal respect and meeting people face to face. That's what changed the politics. As you know from the book, I uncovered a fair amount about the Buckley family's history and Southern segregation. That's some, not all, but some of the big news in the book. Well, how did Buckley overcome that? Well, one example is a guy who's become a friend of mine. He's now a renowned epidemiologist, retired. It was at Duke University. His name is Dr. Sherman James. And as I was going through the correspondence, it's one of my favorite stories in the book.
I have it. It's on my list to talk about.
Okay. Well, yeah. And so, good. So we'll discuss it. It says 1967, Vietnam War. Bill Buckley, huge supporter of the Vietnam War. Students are protesting, and a lot of them are, what shall we say, privileged white students who don't want to serve and are able to get out of the war through student deferments and all the rest.
Right.
And Buckley, who was then doing his famous show Firing Lines, 1967, gets a very elegantly composed, handwritten letter. Dear Mr. Buckley, I'm a fan of your show. I know that you're an admirer of Senator Goldwater. Can you tell me why it is that I, a lieutenant, an Air Force lieutenant, and a Negro serving my country, can't find an apartment to live in? And Buckley instantly writes to Gold. He writes to him, Sherman James, and he said, I'm so glad you wrote to me. We're going to be on it. He writes a letter to Goldwater. What's going on? Goldwater says, well, he said, yes, people know that I oppose a lot of the Civil Rights Act nationally, but I thought we got rid of all the prejudice, right, in Arizona. And he gets on the case, and Sherman James and I go back and forth and discuss all this. And I said, well, what drew you to Buckley in the first place? And he said, I liked his sense of humor, and his program was an education to tune in and hear Buckley, because that's what Buckley assumed. Mona, you're talking the highest level. You do not disguise or dumb down that amazing vocabulary he had, which was really unmatched. I've looked at the volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary Buckley had in his office. I don't mean the 2-volume set I have that you read.
No, he had a bigger one.
He had the full one. He had the full one, and you can pick off you can pick out a volume and turn the pages and see how they're worn. And he thought you can go before the public and you can talk that way. You can talk to your opponents that way. And he was a fantastic listener. That was even Rick Brookhiser, our friend, right, who knew Buckley as well as anyone, said it had not occurred to him till he read my book what a great listener Buckley had been, because you were so charmed and dazzled by him. You kind of forgot he never interrupted you when you spoke. He asked you follow-up questions. He seemed to remember what you told him. That's why people called him a great conversationalist, because of his talent for listening. And of course, for a debater, that's essential, because you want to, there's a strategic purpose for it, but it's also his nature to be that way.
So he came from, and you devote a lot of attention in the book to the Buckley family, to William F. Buckley Sr., his dad. It's interesting. They had 10 children, he and his wife, Aloise. It's interesting that, and I did not know until reading your book why it was because the Buckleys had 2 sons before Bill, but neither of them was named for the dad. And you observe in the book that you think it's because by the time Bill Buckley Jr. comes along, the father felt more confident about where he was in the world and ready to have a namesake. And that maybe he wasn't ready before that. It was really interesting insight. But okay, so his father is a very, you paint a portrait of him too that's multi-layered. On the one hand, he was tremendously generous to the people who worked for him, including the Negro people that he employed in South Carolina, where he would do unbelievably generous gestures, giving them lavish gifts, paying for the college tuition of their children, etc. But at the same time, he was a racist, an anti-Semite, and he was part of the White Citizens Council movement that so disfigured the South during the Civil Rights era.
That was so much fun to try to capture in a narrative, writer to writer, to tell that story was the biggest challenge I had and the most rewarding. And it's funny because I'll hear from people, friends, great admirers of Bill Buckley who knew him, and they'll say, oh, I was so shocked when I read those chapters. I was so disheartened. And I said, I can understand that, but they were really for a narrative writer that was such rich material. And there, Mona, what I figured I had to do, and let me just add a few details to it, you've captured so much of it, is that that while Bill Buckley and his 9 siblings were raised in Connecticut, now that I live here, we call the Northwest Corner, which is just across the state line from Dutchess County and just below New York and just below the Massachusetts state line where the Berkshires, Western Massachusetts is. That's where Buckley grew up. So when the Buckleys, who were raised to be extremely conservative, hated that man in the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, in the 1930s, Bill Buckley was born in 1925, so he's a child then. It's the guy they used to see at the horse show in Rhinebeck, New York. It's not some distant alien figure of hatred. And in fact, Roosevelt's law firm had done a pretty lousy job of representing Buckley Sr.'s oil company when they'd had a tangle in Mexico in the late 20s. So there's a lot of personal stuff going on here. It's a world of privileged people all across the spectrum ideologically. It's really important to understand. Well, so the Buckleys grew up there, or rather, Bill and his siblings in Charen, Connecticut, this beautiful little town in Connecticut, which is worth seeing. You can see the house to this day on Main Street. But in the winters, they went south. They went to their second gorgeous home called Kamchatka, and had been built by the famous Civil War diarist, Mary Boykin Chestnut's husband, for her.
That was an amazing detail, too. I had no idea. Mary Chestnut's house.
That was her house. And Buckley Sr., who had a brilliant eye for design, decoration, external architecture, landscaping, built these beautiful terraced lawns and these outbuildings for his family. That was in Camden, South Carolina, which was really one of the seats of the Revolutionary War. That's where Andrew Jackson the teenage Andrew Jackson was captured and imprisoned, was in Camden, South Carolina.
Interesting.
And also, it turned out to be a site of white resistance to the civil rights movement after Brown. And how did I find that out? Well, I knew my wife, Kathy, was very shrewd about these things. She said, look, the Buckley Archive at Yale, down the road from me, is huge, but you have to get outside it. And that is something I tell younger historians and biographers too. Don't imprison yourself within a single archive. Even if you're writing a presidential biography, there are other places to look. So she said, well, let's see what Buckley was doing in the South, because his father bought the house in 1938 when Bill Buckley was 13, remodeled it over the next couple of years, and that's where they spent their winters. Why did they go there? Because Buckley Sr. was a Southerner, and his wife, Aloise, was a Southerner. He was from South Texas. She was from New Orleans. So the Buckleys considered and called themselves culturally Southern. So at that point, the pieces start to come together a little bit. You see how Buckley, who seems to be this Yankee patrician, is really a child of the South who's Catholic, growing up in Protestant Yankee New England, and they're actually not fitting in quite so well as you might think in the North. And when they go down south, then they're treated as a great family coming home. And so that's
Except let me just ask you a little bit about that, because I stumbled over that part because I thought, there are far more Catholics, maybe not in the northwest corner of Connecticut, but there are far more Catholics in the Northeast than there are in the South. The South is almost Catholic free. So why did this Catholic, except for New Orleans, of course, but why did this Catholic family feel so much more at home in Camden than in Connecticut?
It's a really great question. I think one answer is, I can tell you, you like the details, the concrete aspects of the book. When you drive through the main street in where the churches are in Camden, it's called Littleton Street, and you see the one church after another, these beautiful churches. And the Catholic church there was built in the Mexican style. Bill's father had lost his first fortune as an oil man in Mexico at the time of the Mexican Revolution. And this is a beautiful church that's there with all the other great churches. When you go to Charen, Connecticut, you see right across the beautiful green, the long 1.5 mile long green in Charen, you see the old and respected churches in town, the Congregationalist Church and the Episcopal Church. They're always the main ones in old colonial Connecticut towns. You have to go around the corner to what almost feels like a back street to see the very modest little Catholic church where the Buckleys worshipped, alongside groomsmen, scullery maids, the old terminology. This is the Depression. Irish Catholic, people whose parents worked in mines and are now working. What we came to call the white working class. Yeah. That's who they worshipped alongside. In Camden, because the caste was different, it was kind of black and white and wealthy and poor without those other ethnic divisions in between. So glad you asked me that. You're the first person who's raised that question. You could feel that you're a kind of aristocrat in Camden, which is a Catholic. And Bill Buckley's mother, Alarise, when they moved to that house in the 1920s, right before Bill Buckley was born, she got the calling cards from the Protestant matrons with the corner turned down, saying, you don't have to bother to come visiting, right? So that prejudice was much more ingrained there. And the names of the towns in Litchfield County is English, Salisbury, and Cornwall. And, they're very Anglophile culture. And the Buckleys were also Irish. So they're out of it in that way, too.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So in the course of describing the Southern culture that was a big part of who the 10 Buckley children become, they think of themselves as being partly Southern. And all of them, it's not, I shouldn't speak for all of them, but the ones that I knew, put that part of their past away and acknowledged that their racism was wrong and that it was a terrible error. But I'd like to read to you from your own book, from the quote from the famous historian Harry Jaffa, who said, "The origins of American conservatism is the ideology of the Old South in the 1860s," he said in 2010. "It never changed." What's your comment on that?
You know who he said that to? Was me.
I figured.
I went out to Claremont because he was in his 90s then, and he was an intellectual giant and a friend of Bill Buckley. He admired Buckley very much. And I was really surprised by that because it's not entirely true.
No.
Harry Jaffa, did you know him at all, Mona?
I did not.
Meet him? Bill Buckley, as usual, had the last word on him. And he said, if you think Harry Jaffa is impossible to disagree with, try agreeing with him. I mean, you just couldn't do right by him. He was angry at everybody, including the neoconservatives, although Harry was Jewish. He thought Irving Kristol didn't show him enough respect.
One of those.
Yeah,
gotcha.
One of those. Why isn't he better known? And he was a brilliant man and a brilliant thinker. He was the first true disciple of Leo Strauss in America, for your viewers who know who Strauss, the great political philosopher, was. And Jaffa had decided that he alone held the keys to a true American conservatism. And where it came down to was this very specific thing that he was right about, Mona, something that you find when you go back and look at the National Review coverage of the very first modern Civil Rights Act, not the ones that were passed under Lyndon Johnson in 64 and 65, but the earlier one that Robert Caro wrote an entire book about, great book called Master of the Senate. The very first modern Civil Rights Act, when National Review was saying the South, they always said the South, meaning the white South. Buckley, in a notorious editorial, said, why the South must prevail.
Must prevail.
They were drawing on the arguments of John C. Calhoun, who was it was a kind of genius. And one thing I tried
that was pretty shocking, I have to say, when I read that part of your book. I mean, honestly, Calhoun, who said slavery was a positive good.
Positive good. But I'll tell you something else, though, Mona. If you go back and look at some of the big liberal historians of that period, Richard Hofstadter said in his famous book on the American political tradition, said John Calhoun was the first primary thinker, meaning original thinker, since the founders. So he's saying he's a better political analyst and philosopher than Lincoln. That's the liberal Richard Hofstadter. So the arguments are brilliant and powerful and totally perverse. Like Calhoun is using almost like the numbers of like the Electoral College and showing how states can defy the central government. The whole states rights argument, Calhoun had worked out in a really elaborate way. So not just Buckley, you were probably also surprised to see the great James Burnham.
James Burnham, yeah.
They all took up the argument.
Yeah.
And they said, well, the South has the right to keep, you and we're just using the terminology of the day, so we don't want people to be triggered by this.
Right.
That they have the right to keep the Negro from voting. And and here's another thing I'll add about that, Mona. First of all, Bill wrote that editorial. It was not considered outrageous in its day. People didn't necessarily agree with it, but they were not shouting from the rooftops, this man is a
totally different world. No, it was a different world.
Well, when Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great liberal historian, reviewed the book where Buckley reiterated that, in fact, elaborated on that argument, his book, Up From Liberalism, Schlesinger reviewed it in the New York Times, and he just has a passing line that says, well, of course, Buckley supports states' rights and doesn't think black people should vote. On to the next point. So that was within the realm of, what shall we say, respectable discourse back then.
It was. But, so one of the things that is admirable about Buckley, as I've said, is that he was able and was not hampered by ego. So he was willing, bear in mind, he had a huge ego. But what I mean to say is he was willing to look at himself, to look at his previous views and to correct them and to say that was wrong, I was wrong. And there are very few people who are willing to do that, one finds. Don't you agree?
Yes. And why is that? Or maybe we should ask, why do you think he was able to do it? You knew him. You know him at least as well as I did. Why do you think he was able to do that?
Well, I think that he had a fundamental integrity. And he was always searching for the truth. And, even if, as I learned from your book, he was willing to be, sometimes in debate, he was willing to take the low road a little bit in the sense of, maybe massaging an argument. But I don't know. I attribute it to integrity. What do you attribute it to?
I think integrity is a great word to use. There is a very interesting exchange he had with John Cogley. Do you remember him? He was a New York Times religion reporter for a while, but he'd also been an editor of Commonweal, the liberal Catholic magazine, which in some ways was kind of the opposite number of National Review.
Yeah.
And the two would tangle. But Cogley really admired Buckley, and Buckley admired him because they were both so respectful of good writing and good argument. And so Buckley is a letter to John Cogley he wrote in the late 1950s. And also, for listeners who will be interested to know, it was John Cogley who wrote the text of the famous speech John F. Kennedy gave in Houston about separation of church and state.
Oh,
he drafted that statement for him.
Yeah,
so he was a giant in that world.
Yeah.
And Buckley is watching television, and he sees on the Mike Wallace program, which was a very big interview program for many, many years. And Wallace, like everyone else, became Buckley's friend. And Cogley praised Buckley. And this is early. This is in the late 1950s. And Buckley wrote him a letter, and he said, I was so pleased and impressed when you said that. He said, I wonder if I would have the integrity, your word, Mona, to do the same. Okay. So here what I'll say is, since part of my job, I'm a Jewish writer, is to try to learn a little bit about Catholicism, is integrity really means wholeness, right? To integrate things, something to be integral, right? To be whole, to be a whole person, a whole Catholic. You have to learn to see people who and for what they are, totally apart from ideology and belief. And I'll tell you, one reason this is a joy to talk to you is I'm doing a number of interviews where people just want to reduce Bill Buckley to his opinions. Was he on the right side of this? We like him because he opposed the war in Iraq. We don't like him because of his racial views. And that's as if there's no person there, just a checklist. And this is happening more and more. And I think especially it's disturbing to me with younger people. Well, to me, a younger person is anyone under 50.
Under 40, yeah.
And they're brilliant. They've read everything. They know everything. They're great writers. But this is how they have learned to see the world in our incredibly polarized time. So Buckley seems like a kind of antique. And yet you think, but these are the enduring human values. These don't belong to antiquity. They're supposed to be what we say now. I'll add one more thing to that. One of the first people I talked with at length about this book was Andrew Sullivan, who's an interesting guy to talk to because he's kind of quasi-conservative and quasi-not. He's gay. He's Catholic.
Yeah.
And he really admired Buckley. And he said, two things struck him in the book. He said, nobody ever has a bad word to say about him personally. Even Gore Vidal is talking about, he's pushing his buttons, but personally he says nobody ever says a bad word about him. The other thing is, he said, Bill Buckley did what a Catholic is told to do every Sunday at Mass, which is to be a good neighbor and Christian every single day of the week. So when you meet somebody, you bring Cornell West on firing line or a Black Panther. You say, how do you do, Mr. Newton, Mr. Cleaver? Please tell me what your opinions are.
Yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. Oh, and can I just mention something else in your book where you did that? You did the same thing of providing the perspective on the whole man. So I was before reading your book, I was quite dubious about Brent Bozel. Because the famous Bill Buckley's brother-in-law, he was the author of Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative. But in his later life, he became a very radical right-wing Catholic. He moved to Franco's Spain, where he was perfectly comfortable. And he was sort of a precursor of what today we would call Catholic integralists. And yet, in your book, I was actually moved to read that he may have had all kinds of cracked ideas, but he lived out his faith. This man went to homeless shelters. He went to soup kitchens to help those who were most in need. He
went to AIDS hospices. Mona.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was so moving. It was like, don't ever judge people until you have a full picture,
Somebody told me, a good friend of mine, great writer who read the book, said, that brought him to tears.
Yeah, same.
You really can't believe it. I'm so glad you brought him up because I find time and time again when people look, we know there's been a lot written about this book and much of it very favorable. I have no complaints. But it's always about Buckley himself. It's filled with all these other very interesting characters who never come up. So I'm glad you brought up Bozel because a case can be made that it's Bozel who's really the godfather of the politics. The wonderful, humane Bozel will set aside. We've just discussed him. But the ideologue, the one who would not give an inch to the other side and staged one of the very first militant attacks on an abortion clinic, wearing a beret like a Black Panther. That was Brent Bozel. And Buckley was shocked by that, by the way, that he would do it. And in some ways, Bozel was really more the originator of the cultural take no prisoners politics we have today. And so that's one of the themes that goes through the book. And I attribute that partly, and this comes from doing reporting and research and talking to a lot of Catholics and Catholic intellectuals. Brent Bozel was a convert. And it's the Catholic converts. We don't want to name any names right here, or if you'd like to, we can. But you talk about the post-liberal group that we're hearing a lot from now. Many of them Catholics. A lot of them are converts to Catholicism.
I'll name a name, J.D. Vance.
Okay, J.D. Vance. So there's a good name to start with. Why does he become more doctrinaire and unforgiving than a lifelong Catholic? And it was the cradle Catholics who made me understand why. And it fits in perfectly with Buckley. So this is interesting. He said, well, if you are raised in the church and live especially as people would in an earlier generation, in a Catholic neighborhood, there's a great variety of opinions, sentiments, ways of worship that people have, and they're all still Catholics. It would never have crossed Buckley's mind to say Joe Biden is not a true Catholic. He would know that he would. He goes to Mass. He goes to Mass still on Sunday. You can disagree with him about all these issues. Buckley really disliked Jack Kennedy's Catholicism, but he never said he wasn't a Catholic. Gary Wills and Buckley became mortal enemies. Each one said the other's a true Catholic. And that's where the converts change the game, because they come in and it's all about a kind of religious ideology to them, not a feeling of neighborly commitment, not a feeling of fellowship. There's a wonderful moment found in a letter that the great, wonderful archivist in Camden was able to verify for me. It was written by a Black woman named Lily Francis, who lived in Camden. And she once asked Eloise Buckley, Bill Buckley's mother, for some money so she could buy the first crib for her third child. None of her children had ever had a crib. Here they are, and they're middle class Black people in Camden. Her husband is a teacher at the famous Mather School that James Clyburn went to, but she can't afford to buy these simple, basic things any mom would want for a child. So a check for $100 came in the mail. $100 is a lot in 1950.
In those days, yeah.
And in those days. So she explains all the things she bought, and then she says, "You are my friend." She said, "We've never met. You are my friend." That comes out of Christian teaching.
Absolutely.
The friend. Right. And that was the thing that Buckley had. And yeah, if you are strictly by, the ideology, liturgy in the Catholic Church, you may acknowledge that in some technical way, the way JD does. He says, well, we have a hierarchy of friends we look after, right? The ones closest
till
to
he
us.
Was rebuked by the Pope himself.
The Pope himself. Right, a guy from Chicago, right?
No, the previous Pope, actually. The previous Pope, yes.
Francis did too. Yeah.
He did, yeah.
He did, yeah. It's really something, and that was a key, getting to that.
Okay,
so understand how the Catholicism worked. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a good segue into another aspect. So Bill Buckley had a kind of pure faith. He, as you say in the book, and I knew this from knowing him, he never doubted. He was unlike most humans. He never doubted. He was always sure, as he put it, that my Redeemer liveth. And that capacity for total faith was in some ways a beautiful thing, in some ways an ennobling thing, as we see his remarkable generosity to so many people. You cover some of it, Sam, but you barely scratched the surface of all the people that he helped, that he gave money to, that he supported. I mean, it's just phenomenal. People at National Review, when I was there, were constantly sharing stories about how, this person, couldn't afford a down payment on their first house, kind of a working class person at National Review, not one of the writers, but, one of the support staff. And this somehow came to Bill's attention, and before you know it, the guy receives a check for the down payment, et cetera. I mean, there were just so many stories like that. So on the one hand, that was one side of his faith. It was ennobling for him. But there's a flip side to faith, which you talk about, and that's credulity.
Yeah.
And this came up with one of his worst mistakes in his life, which was this relationship with Edgar Smith, a convicted murderer on death row in New Jersey, who wrote to Bill. And I actually before we sat down today, I pulled out my Buckley folder, which is about this thick. Okay. All the letters that we exchanged over the years. I remembered that we had written about the Edgar Smith case. And anyway, it was, so why don't you set up the story and give us your interpretation of why Bill was taken in by this con man.
And he was taken in. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So in the early 1960s, a news clipping came into National Review, and it went to an assistant editor. You had jobs like that, jobs to open the mail. Bill Buckley's voluminous mail. Bill Buckley got, at the height of his fame, 600 letters a week, and one way or another found a way to answer each one, even if it's only dictating a line in his limousine. Nevertheless, if you wrote to him, you heard back. That's how you build a movement, by the way. We did in those days. So a news clipping comes in the mail. It's a death row inmate. It's a quite sympathetic profile of him that appeared in a New Jersey newspaper. And it said young Edgar Smith, who was convicted of first-degree murder in 1957, brutal slaying of a 15-year-old high school girl who'd had bashed her head in with a baseball bat. I mean, it's a horrific story. Had been almost instantly, he had confessed and almost instantly been sentenced to death row. And since then had become a very skilled jailhouse lawyer. He turned out to have a Mensa quality IQ. And the news clipping reported how Smith and his mother were fighting to get his case overturned because the Warren Court was beginning its new wave of decisions that supported prisoners' rights or felons' rights or just the rights of the accused. Yes. And Edgar Smith thought he could make the case that his confession had been forced from him, that it had been
coerced.
Coerced, thank you, after hours of interrogation. And the news clipping also said that Edgar Smith was a reader of National Review and a fan of Barry Goldwater. So there's 1962. It's the peak of the draft Goldwater movement just before he got the nomination. And of course, Bill Buckley and Brent Bozel, even more so, were instrumental in all of that. And so the assistant passes the news clipping on to Bill. And Bill says, well, that's interesting. And later, this news assistant, a man named Don Cox from Canada, who lives there now, he's a lawyer, took an interest in the case of the legal aspects. And he said, well, we just didn't think anybody who read National Review could really be guilty of a violent crime. So we'll set that aside and point out instead he wasn't really a reader of National Review. One copy had come through that he'd looked at, right? But he's beginning to see, once Buckley gets in touch with him, Edgar Smith turns out to be one of his era's great con men. And he was brilliant at it. We're not used to brilliant con men in our day and age.
No. We don't know anything about that.
They're just gone.
Thank goodness we're done with that.
To live in the era we do now. So, and the correspondence begins. Edgar Smith has a lot of time on his hands and death row.
Yes.
And as this is a Buckley-style mordant joke, Buckley gives him a lifetime subscription to National Review to a man who's on death row. But Edgar Smith gets the joke. So they're going back and forth. And he's filing appeal after appeal. And he's getting rejected, Smith. But each one is better argued than the one before. And he's postponing his execution. And finally, Buckley goes to visit him in the Trenton State Prison in 1965. And here we insert, at the very moment, Buckley was becoming a true household name because he was waging the most hilarious, brilliant campaign for mayor of New York. That's what made Buckley really famous. And as we know, rescued the conservative movement at a dire time.
By the way, the Unmaking of a Mayor, which was his account that he wrote afterwards of this race, is delightful.
It's a delight. I'm glad you brought it up because I'm finding in almost all the conversations, you're the first person who hasn't brought it up. It's always God and Man at Yale, which is a work of kind of perverse genius. We get it. He foretold everything that's going on now in colleges, even gave you the playbook for how to fight back, down to, donors withholding contributions. Yes. All out. Well, but Unmaking of a Mayor, the title itself is hilarious. It comes from Tony White's book, right? The Making of the President, Unmaking of a Mayor. So Buckley's got all these enormous gifts that are becoming very public now. And he decides that Edgar Smith must be innocent. Why? Because Edgar Smith told him so. Actually, what Edgar does is keep writing around in his voluminous letters the real question of guilt. And he says things like, well, what good is it going to do me here if I say I'm innocent? And Buckley just falls for him. And not only that, because he's Bill Buckley, because he's so philanthropic and charitable, it's not good enough that he come to Edgar Smith's aid. He's got to get him a literary agent. He has to get him
lawyer.
A great editor at Alfred Knopf. He gets him a lawyer, and he gets him sprung.
He also pays for the lawyer, you say in the book.
Yeah, pays for everything. Pays for everything. And he gets him sprung. Almost 10 years later. And some people have wondered, why did I, in this book, spend so much time in Edgar Smith? You answered it yourself. You have correspondence where Edgar Smith's name came up. Bill Buckley talked about him all the time. It was one of the great missions in his life, was to establish that Edgar Smith was innocent. Not that he had been rehabilitated, but that he was innocent. Lots of writers in those days, the 60s, like to take up the cause of convicted murderers. It gave you a kind of coolness and
frisson.
That's it, the frisson, the nostalgia de la boue, look at me, I know what it's like to hang out with a killer. So Norman Mailer did it, and William Stuyvesant. Truman Capote, most famously of all. Yeah. And Buckley tried to get Capote to blurb the book. And he wouldn't do it, but he went on television, went on Firing Line, and said how extraordinary Edgar Smith was. And Truman Capote had interviewed, by this time, dozens of death row inmates, and they're all taken in by Edgar Smith. And so you're quite right. I found that to be really important. But here's the other thing that surprised me. So the young guy at National Review, Don Cox, wanted to write in National Review an article. It's a year later after they first met him, 1963, that's going to make the case for Smith's possibly having been wrongly convicted. And he does it in a lawyerly way. And Buckley guides him all the way through. He said, don't overstate your case. This is a magazine that actually favors capital punishment. We're not on a crusade to overturn, all this jurisprudence. We just want to say this man is innocent. So that's the line they take. And then when Buckley wrote his famous article in Esquire magazine, which you might have noticed, Mona, because of the title, it's called The Approaching End of Edgar Smith. That echoes the title of what was probably Buckley's greatest ever essay, The End of Whittaker Chambers, also published in Esquire, also based on the correspondence he'd had. Chambers and Buckley, which is one of the great collections of letters published in our time, and or a little before our time, and the Edgar Smith letters are here in Esquire, and they're very smart and clever. They sound a little too much like Bill Buckley. You even start to pick up Smith is right. He knows what buttons to push. And Buckley decides he's going to, in this cleverly, elegantly written essay, raise doubts about Smith's conviction. And what did I find when I compared that Esquire magazine to the original one Don Cox had written for National Review? This is what happens when you work that quickly. Bill had just lifted his account and stuck it in his own. Where were Esquire's fact checkers? You couldn't get away with that then. You can't get away with it now. Mona, you can't write a column in the Bulwark that comes right out of, Jonathan Last's or something and pretend you wrote it. And you couldn't do it back then either. Somehow Bill Buckley got away with it. Because he was a kind of bird of paradise. He's the one conservative writing for Esquire. He's a lovely person. He becomes great friends with the editor, Harold.
Of course.
He does the kind of thing you're talking about, writes him the letter so Hayes can be accepted into the co-op in Manhattan, writes the letter so Hayes' kid gets admitted to the elite boarding school, all this stuff. They gave Bill Buckley a pass time and time again. And that increased my interpretation combined with his religious faith, convinced him, Bill, that nothing he did could ever be tainted by really, really bad judgment, even though so often it was, or anything but the highest motives. So even after Smith was released from prison and several years later stabbed another young woman and came within an inch of murdering her, Buckley said, I was wrong about Edgar Smith, but he never said, I was wrong to defend him. Nobody, right. He said, well, hundreds of other people thought he was innocent too. Yes, Bill, because you persuaded them.
Because you did it. But it is a dramatic moment in the book where you describe that Smith on the lam, after he commits the second an attempted murder, now that he's been freed with Buckley's help, he phones Buckley.
Yeah.
And that must have been something. Buckley hangs up the phone, probably without saying goodbye, and calls the FBI.
Calls the FBI. Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because in the interim, Smith was released in December of 1971 and committed that second heinous crime about 5 years later. In the interim, he'd been getting into all kinds of trouble that Buckley was covering for. He was not, he was a petty criminal. So
he was.
He
was a criminal, not petty.
He
was a criminal.
Just a criminal. And Buckley was covering up for him. If Edgar had credit card debt, Bill would write the check for him. Time and time again, he would do these things and not talk about them in that same way. He would just kind of quietly do it. And so that's the glory of Bill Buckley and also the downfall. And so as you're right, the way I kind of formulate it at the end of the book is, Buckley had these two sides. There was faith, and faith can become delusion. They're kind of opposites of one another. They fit together. And that's because, as you said, he never doubted himself. How about when he's in college and he lands a plane when he doesn't know how to land it? We know what happened to another Catholic, John F. Kennedy Jr., when he tried to do that.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah.
I mean, it could have gone very differently, but
Bill
tells the story, and for when he retells the story in one of his books, it is a lark. It's funny. It's, he's got, did he have Brent Bozel with him? He had somebody with him. Who had the scare of his life.
That was the crash landing. Yeah, the second one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah. As if it's nothing. And, that was Buckley.
And I loved the, I actually knew this before, but it was funny to be reminded of it in your book so when he sailed, which was one of his great passions, and he wrote a number of books about, he was reckless in the way he would pilot his boats, and he would be standing and steering the boat with his foot, and according to his son Christopher, that you repeat in the book, he crashed into so many docks up and down the eastern seaboard that they called him Captain Crunch.
Mona, did you know Peter Flanagan, the Republican in New York, wealthy banker? He was a friend of Buckley's. And Bill used to like take people to the yacht club for lunch in New York. After he first took Henry Kissinger to lunch. And he took me there once or twice. And once Peter Flanagan was there, and he came up to me and he said, "What is the problem with this guy when he sails his boat?" He said, "This is the worst sailor I've ever seen." He was so reckless. And Pat Buckley would say, "Are you trying to get us killed?" She refused to go on board. Did he ever invite you on the boat?
No.
Guys. It was a thing. There were a few women, but it was mainly a guy thing. And
it really was. It really was, because it was, it was an opportunity for male bonding. And also, they would strip off their clothes and dive in and do skinny dipping and stuff. And I think having a female around, especially a young one, as I was then, it wouldn't have worked.
And Ross Douthat was one of those guys who went on Bill Buckley's boat. And another Catholic convert. He actually, I think Ross has a little bit of Buckley style in his writing, which is that's kind of grand style. You're not exactly sure what he just said in that sentence sometimes, but very brilliant, and learned it in the same way, and has a way of casting arguments in a new light that you haven't seen them put in before. So you kind of read him even though you don't want to. And I think there was a little bit of that with Buckley too. You just had to know what he was going to say in one of his columns. And as we know, he was writing in the age when a newspaper column was really your mark as a major journalist.
Absolutely. It's what made me want to become a columnist, is that I was modeling my career slightly on his. I was
so
hopeful. I was hopeful of doing 1/20th as much with my life as he did with his, because his output was just unbelievable, prodigious. And you talk about that in the book, that not only did he write 3 columns a week and do a lot of other writing, but he also taped firing line episodes and did 70 speeches a year?
About that, yeah. And wrote novels. And they're all on the bestseller list, nonfiction list, and the fiction list. And I said at one point,
yeah, you said he was competing with himself sometimes, or he had to worry about that.
Yeah, he had to worry about it, had to space them out. And because he wrote so quickly, he needed 2 entire vacations. Because he wrote his books.
So-called vacations.
Yeah,
the rest of us would call it work, but
that's it. Yeah. I mean, he would still do his, the expert slopes in Gestalt on the skis, but then he would go back and write, and it's just how he lived. I think he got a lot of it from his father.
So one time, I will tell you this story from my own experience to give you a sense of why we were all so mad for the guy. So I think I was in law school. I had written a piece for National Review that was on the cover, and I get a letter from Bill Buckley saying that while he was in Gestad, he had been approached by Roger Moore, a.k.a. James Bond at the time. He was starring in all the James Bond movies. And that Roger Moore had praised my piece in National Review. So Bill said, I asked him for his autograph, and I'm enclosing it with love. And he said, P.S. You're making me famous! !
Oh, that's so great.
Now, is that adorable or what? I mean,
what do you think about the idea, Mona, that I developed this, and my wife, Kathy, because she got to know Bill pretty well too and loved him, came up, thinks there's some plausibility to it. All right, so there are 10 kids in the family, and Bill's in the middle. He's really the middle of the middle. He's the 6th. And so he craves attention the way all middle kids do. And, the older ones are taking up all the oxygen, and the younger ones are coddled, and there he is. Well, the 2 surrounding siblings were sisters, Jane, who was slightly older, and Trish, who became Mrs. Brent Bozel, slightly younger. And I had the impression that he was more comfortable with women, and treating them as equals, social relationships, than most men in that era. Set aside their politics, just as there was homophobia on the left back then, just as much as there was on the right. There was also misogyny on the left. Read about the Weather Underground or the Black Panthers,
God, yes. Yeah.
And so all that was there. Buckley didn't really have it. I assume he treated you like just a smart editorial person on staff.
Absolutely. It didn't ever cross my mind that I was being treated as, in fact, in some ways, I was treated. There had been a message that had come down from the top staff before I arrived about how the editorial assistant was not going to be allowed to submit editorials for the week section, which was the front of the book that, was these short little editorials. And I did a couple of submissions, and then, he let it be known that actually that rule was being changed. So
nice.
So, I really did not get a sense of at all that I was being treated differently because I was a woman. And of course, Priscilla was a huge part of that. She was a big booster, and she was critical to the whole functioning of the magazine. And, but you said something early on in our interview that I think is the right word. The Buckleys, all of them, but Bill most of all, had magic. They just did. They just, when you were in their company, they lit up a room, and the whole experience of having worked there was joyful in that sense. I'm not saying it was never, we never had any problems, but they had a certain magic, interpersonal magic with other human beings that I don't think I've ever experienced since.
I heard somebody I got to know, the first wife, because he was married twice, John Leonard, the great journalist, who had your job some years before you did, before he left and became a really famous literary critic and editor. she said, his wife, Tiana said, she got to met Bill Buckley in Stanford, I think in 1959 or 60. And she said, it was Jack Kennedy. It was like Jack. And she came from a family of Kennedy idolaters. The way he bounded into a room, the social ease, it was a Kennedy thing. And
absolutely.
he had it. And we were fortunate, you and I, to feel a little bit of that magic. Even as he got older, it never went away. And Gary Wills said, Bill Buckley was just an exciting person to be around. He just had that gift of, as you say, of lighting up the room, lighting up your life.
Absolutely. I'm looking now for the final paragraph in your book because I think it was so beautifully stated. In clearing so large a place for himself, he left a vacuum no one since has been able to fill. This is the absence so many feel today, adversaries and apostates, as well as advocates and admirers. A founder of our world, he speaks to us from a different one, beyond our reach, but hovering near. If only we can discover in ourselves the imagination and generosity, the kindness and warmth that Bill Buckley demonstrated time and again in his long and singular life. So beautifully put. And this book, it's long, but it really, it brought so many memories back for me that were positive. And then, of course, there are aspects of this that are disturbing. I mean, the fact that the John Birch Society was not, as I had been raised to believe as a young conservative in the late 70s and 80s, sort of this little fringe thing that had happened, and Bill had scooted them away from the movement, and that was that. No, they were a central part of conservatism, and they still are.
They still are. That's
the thing. I did not realize. So my friend Charlie Sykes has said that it was like a recessive gene that is now the dominant.
Oh, interesting. Now, he's from Wisconsin, right?
Right.
Because Wisconsin always had those super tensions, It's the state of La Follette and Joe McCarthy.
Exactly.
And so he gets that. There's no doubt about it. And there's a kind of thing that is part of who we are as Americans, too. I don't see it as a purely ideological thing. It's I'm now reading a lot about the Black Panthers. I've gotten interested in them. And they embrace this cult of violence very early. And what they remind me of is the Proud Boys and the militias today. They're stockpiling guns. They assume there's going to be a violent revolution. They've somehow gotten the message that that's how America works. The more violent you are, the more successful. And it's in us. Mona, not every single one of us, but it's there someplace. And it's very hard to make sense of. And you hope for leaders who will eventually realize the danger, but sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Well, Sam, this has been a delight. I could talk to you all day, but I know you have another appointment to get to, so I think we will leave it there. But thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for writing this book.
Oh, such a pleasure, Mona. It was really fun to talk about all this with you.